Hi everyone. My name is Kieran, and I'm going to be doing a short presentation. Well, hopefully it'll be short. And I'm going to share my screen for that.
If we can do that. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Wonderful. I like having presentations sometimes with these things, right? It gets just kind of breaks up the just the people talking kind of aspect.
Yeah,
So
I thought that would be
thanks for
nice to
this.
have a visual element to it.
Yeah. Thanks, Kieran.
So today we're going to be talking about some pretty heavy duty topics. So I thought that we should start by doing a bit of definition, just explaining what we mean by a term like imperialism. I think this is a word that's not always understood. Some people seem to think that it's only about war, where countries go to war or countries take over other countries militaristically. But that's not really what we mean when we say imperialism. So imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism, which basically means when corporations consolidate into and they kill smaller corporations, and it becomes where you have these massive multinational corporations. It's also imperialism includes the reality of rich countries, so usually Western countries, developed countries, not another word for it, using all of their might, including their military, to forcibly exploit poor countries. And that could be done militaristically, using the military, but also could be done using financial entities like the IMF, for example. Um, and in the system of imperialism, which is where we live in the whole world, we are living under imperialism. The poor countries of the world, or the countries in the global south, they must remain underdeveloped. They have to remain underdeveloped. And by that, we mean they have to remain without infrastructure, without technology, without healthcare, without proper education for their people, things like that, because that is what keeps them poor. And keeping them poor is important so that they can be exploited, which makes the wealthy elite of the rich countries wealthier. So that's how we extract profits from the poor of the global south. So that's what we mean when we say imperialism. Now, probably Lenin's definition from the book Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, which is available online for free. So if you haven't read it, I highly recommend reading it. There's five specific characteristics under what he describes as imperialism. So that would be movement from free market competition to monopoly capitalism. So like I said, what starts off with the idea of capitalism is, oh, everybody just competes in a free market. It becomes where the more efficient companies end up eating up or killing off the smaller companies, and becoming, where there's just five media companies in the US, for example, that own all the media outlets and things like that. So that's what we're approaching monopoly capitalism when that happens. Then the consolidation of capital into trusts, cartels, banks, and the merger into a new higher form of monopoly called finance capital. The imperialist economies also rely heavily on the export of capital instead of the export of commodities. They also divide the world between international monopoly corporations, and eventually there's a division of the world between imperialist powers, and that can include imperialist countries going to war over the exploitation of poor countries. So that was what we saw with, especially in World War I, for example, and to some extent World War II. I also recommend reading Kwame Nkrumah, who wrote in he was the first president of Ghana, which was the first country in Africa to gain its independence from the British colonialism. And he wrote a book called Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, also available online for free. And, he kind of took Lenin's idea a little bit further and explained that as in place of colonialism as the main instrument of imperialism, we have today neocolonialism. The essence of neocolonialism is that the state, which is subject to neocolonialism, is in theory independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty, but in reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from outside. So outside, Western powers, imperialist powers, they still control the economies, even though these countries are supposedly now independent of colonialism. So that's the idea. So highly recommend reading him too. So I wanted to give an example of how this relates to LGBTQ people like us. You have companies like Raytheon, for example. This is their current logo if you go on Twitter. This is obviously the LGBT rainbow plus black, brown solidarity, trans solidarity. So, they're using a very, very, you know, showing so much support for gay rights and LGBTQ rights. But what they actually produce as a company are weapons of mass destruction, weapons of mass destruction, really. Things like the Tomahawk cruise missile, the Excalibur, I don't even know what some of this means, but high level, high intensity weapons. And they sell a lot of them. Now, as you can see, they're based in Massachusetts. So again, this is a multinational corporation. They have offices and manufacturing in many countries, but they're based in Massachusetts. So that again shows imperialism. This is an example of an imperialist corporate of a monopoly corporation. And they sell bombs to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia has been using the missiles and defense systems that Raytheon has manufactured to kill and destroy people in Yemen for the last 10 years. So this is, and yet that rainbow logo is supposed to pacify us, like, oh, we're so queer friendly, don't worry about the fact that we have been killing people in Yemen and in other places, or our bombs have. And they're profiting off of that. They're profiting off of the death and misery and famine that's been going on in Yemen, as well as other places. Now, another company is BlackRock. I wanted to use this as an example. So they're an investment management company. They manage $8 trillion, at least $8 trillion US dollars. They're the largest investor in weapons manufacturers. And they are also involved in the deforestation of the Amazon rainforest. So they're based in New York. They're directly profiting from making climate change worse. Okay, so they're directly profiting from deforestation. There's a website called blackrocksbigproblem.com. Highly recommend checking that out. It goes into more detail about what BlackRock is doing. But again, rainbow flag, rainbows on their logos. So, this is their Twitter logo right now, if you go on their Twitter. So, this is not their usual logo, obviously, but they've made it for Pride Month. A nice little rainbow. So these are, again, there are other examples. For example, ICE, which is the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement entity, which oversees the detention of hundreds of thousands of people at the U.S. border, including many children who are in cages. They tweeted earlier in June, about how they are so proud and recognize their LGBTQ employees. I mean, LGBTQ people who are migrants at the border are some of the most abused people, even out of all of the migrants that are being abused at the border. And yet ICE has the gall to say that they recognize their LGBTQ employees, and that's something we should be thankful to them for. Nestle is another one on the right here. The Nestle Corporation has been privatizing water in a lot of global South countries, making sure that people in parts of Africa, parts of Latin America, don't have access to water or have to buy their water, which used to be, available for free. And that's just one example. They have also been accused of employing slave labor, child labor, and things like that. So, and yet they have a nice little rainbow, little birds feeding each other and all that. So it's very cute, and it's all marketing. Also, the Canadian and the U.S. Military has actively been promoting the idea that they are now so gay-friendly and trans-friendly that somehow that makes them good. That makes them, a good place to be. Come and join the military. Come and support the military. And it's also another way of. I know what Chris and Tim are going to talk about, pink washing and homo nationalism. I wanted to show some visuals about that. And finally, I want to get to, on this topic, I want to get to the Israeli apartheid. So on the one hand, Israel promotes itself as a gay Mecca. This is the picture on the left is from a Tel Aviv Pride. I don't know which year, but, and, it promotes itself as a place where queer people are welcome, queer tourism, all of that. And yet we should know, if we don't, I mean, I don't know where you've been hiding if you don't know what Israel's doing in Palestine. Even recently in May, the bombing campaign that happened, the war that happened, which killed dozens of children and a lot of people overall, destroyed residential houses, destroyed media companies, destroyed bookstores. They targeted civilian targets. in Gaza. And they have also cut off medical supplies in Gaza. They have cut off electricity in Gaza. They bombed the only coronavirus, Israel bombed the only coronavirus testing facility in Gaza, and also killed the top coronavirus medical doctor. So, what kind of gay Mecca are we to celebrate when this is what they're doing to Palestinians? Are Palestinians not people? Are there no queer Palestinians? We need to ask ourselves what we are complicit with here. So that's another example. Now, I also wanted to explain that the LGBT friendly faces that these corporations put out is actually, besides the horrible things they're doing outside, in the global South countries, they're also actually some of the most vile. They're giving money to some anti-gay politicians. So according to Forbes, which is, not a socialist magazine by any stretch of the imagination, this was according to Forbes, 9 of the biggest LGBTQ supportive corporations in the US have given $1 million or more to anti-gay politicians in the previous election cycle, totaling more than $14 million. So this is a list of those 9 corporations. So that these are corporations that will put on the rainbow flag at their logo, and they have floats and all that at the pride parades, and yet this is also what they do. So even at home, they're not corporations that are on the side of LGBT people. It's just marketing. Now I wanted to talk a little bit about countries in the global South and the way that it's shown that there are countries in the global South that have homophobic laws on the books and things like that. A lot of those countries, as according to CNN, again, not a socialist source, not an anti-imperialist source by any means, but even CNN had to admit in an article that I found that of the 71 countries around the world in which same-sex sexual relations are illegal, more than half of them are former British colonies or protectorates. So the British Empire, which as somebody who is from a former British colony, I can speak from a personal sort of generational experience. The British Empire, when it came and took over these countries, including where I'm from in South Asia, they brought a lot of their Victorian, morals, right? They're sort of, as we can think of what that means if you have studied the Victorian era and these sort of highly socially conservative, reactionary, norms that were present at that time. The British also exported that into a lot of these colonies, where in a lot of these colonies, in a lot of these places that became colonies, including South Asia, including Turtle Island, North America, where we are, the indigenous cultures actually had what we would consider now LGBTQ people, living experiences. So they might not have these identities like, oh my God, you're this and that's all you are. But there were experiences, there were people in a lot of these places, they were included of transversing, of subverting gender as well as sexual norms. So these were not, it's not like there were no queer people in those cultures. The British actually came and suppressed them. And especially in India, for example, there was, I think, the code was 377. The penal code was promoted, was actually put on the books by the British Empire. And India, the LGBT movement in India has been trying to fight to remove that. So a lot of these countries and in Africa as well, they have a heritage of this British Empire and the colonial homophobia that it brought with it. And I want to say that today, while, back then the British came and they colonized these countries, and also the other colonizers, not just the British, and they brought with them homophobia, and they thought that these indigenous people who were practicing an open kind of sexuality and gender, they were savages, they were backwards, they have to be civilized, they have to be made heterosexual. Now it seems like it's gone the other way, where Western style the identity politics of being LGBTQ, of being an identity. This is a very new concept. Even in the West, this is a new idea. There's a book called The Invention of the Heterosexual, I believe it's called. Highly recommend reading that. And it talks about the medical creation of the categories of heterosexual and homosexual. And the idea of that is it comes out of a particular Western tradition. And to promote that in other countries is seen as a civilizing mission. It's seen as a colonial mission. And whether it's done under the guise of human rights It all comes out when you're from those countries. It sounds like you're just calling us savages and want to civilize us and want to colonize us again. And that's what a lot of people, especially when they're continuing to live under imperialism, that's the experience that occurs. And this is a picture of this painting of Manifest Destiny, which was a painting of America's burden of civilizing, the Western frontier and all the native people that lived there. So that was how the U.S. empire, the U.S. Colonies saw themselves while they were going around, colonizing all of the lands that belong to the indigenous people. So now, in also another aspect, and I'm going to wrap this up soon. Countries in the global south are often kept underdeveloped, like I said in an earlier slide, because that's what is needed for Raytheon to make a profit, for BlackRock to make a profit. They need people to stay poor. If people start getting developed and having education, they're going to want rights. They're going to want better working conditions. And we can't have that, because if they're not poor, then how are they going to make things for us for cheap? So, but this kind of underdevelopment also stifles internal social development. And at the same time, when you're imposing these Western LGBTQ norms, it can hinder the struggle of sexual and gender minorities within those countries. So when it looks like, America, for example, or Canada is keeping those countries poor and then coming in and saying, why aren't you having pride parades? It can seem like you're just trying to, it can actually make it harder for LGBTQ people in those countries to struggle for their own rights and their own experiences. Also, when it comes to actual war sanctions, I mean, we've talked a lot about imperialism as in terms of exploitation, but actual war sanctions, militarism, obviously bombs don't, they don't look for who's LGBTQ and who isn't. People being bombed in Yemen, people being bombed in Gaza. Some of those people are queer, and some of those people are family members of queer people, right? So I don't understand how any queer person can be not affected by how much our identities are being used by these corporations to sell war and to sell exploitation. Sanctions also harm LGBTQ people in poor countries. When during the COVID crisis, people in Iran couldn't get medicine. People in Venezuela still can't get medicine, and there are queer people there. And those sanctions are being imposed by the U.S. and being upheld by Canada and other Western countries, and that's harming queer people in those countries as well. Military funding that Canada, US, other Western countries, imperialist countries, they put so much money in their military that takes away from public funding for social services that LGBTQ people also need here, including housing, healthcare, education. And also sexual, gender, and racial minorities are often used as cannon fodder on the front lines for imperialism profits. So they actually use our images to recruit more queer people so that they can go fight on the front lines for BlackRock, for Raytheon, for Nestle. That's who's making the profits with all these wars and aggressions. Now, my question is, do you want to be commodified after reading all this and hearing about all this? I saw a comment online that says, how do you say, don't bully my community while you drop bombs in other communities? And these are a couple of memes. I'm sure some of you are familiar with them. One of them says, they say the next ones will be sent by a woman. Really makes you feel like you're part of history. So if a bomb is falling and it's being dropped by a drone operator who is a woman or a queer person, that does not make it any better for the people who are being bombed. Okay, and the image on the right is about Republicans and Democrats and how it's the same imperialism, only the Democrats put stickers on it that say Black Lives Matter and rainbow stickers, and yes, we can. So the idea being that we are not, there's no difference between these so-called conservative and liberal factions. They're doing the same thing, especially when it comes to imperialism. So finally, this is the last slide. What can we do? Now, there's a few things we could do. First of all, we need to educate ourselves about colonialism and imperialism. So I've given some resources here. There are more out there. Ask questions, and talk to people. Talk to people who are talking about these things. Speak up and stand up against the imperialist powers of your own country. Use your position as a citizen. So this is important. Speak up against the imperialist powers of your own country. That's very important. We can talk all day long about other countries, but what are you doing to challenge the imperialist powers in your country? Because you're the citizen there, you're paying taxes. That's your first responsibility. Tell your friends, family, coworkers not to believe in imperialist propaganda because your voice matters. Those people who listen to you, talk to them. And of course, finally, join the struggle to build socialism. It's a system that we need, a system that's run by working people, that's run by for our benefit, not the benefit of the wealthy elites in the world, not the benefits of monopoly corporations, but for people like you and me around the world. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.